I've worked as a night security guard for a few years now. It's not a bad job, easy money for the most part, and I've grown to appreciate the quiet. After all, in this line of work, a peaceful night means a successful one. The building I'm stationed at is a corporate office downtown, one of those glass towers that looks impressive during the day, but feels almost haunted when empty at night. Most nights I'm the only one here. I sit in the security office, monitor the cameras, patrol the hallways a couple of times, and lock up the place. It's monotonous, but I prefer it that way. The quiet hum of the building systems and the soft glow of the security monitors have become my routine. Then there's Martin. He's the janitor on the same shift as me, and from the moment I met him, something about him didn't sit right. He's an older guy, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with thinning gray hair and a way of moving that's too quiet. I don't know if it's his hunched posture or the way he always seems to appear without making a sound, but I can never shake the feeling that he's watching me, even when I don't see him. At first, it was just a gut feeling, nothing I could put my finger on. He was polite enough, keeping to himself and occasionally nodding if we passed each other in the hallways. But over time, the strangeness started to add up. One night I was doing my usual rounds, checking the locks and walking the hallways, when I saw him standing in one of the empty offices on the 16th floor. The lights were off, but the glow from the hallway illuminated him just enough. He wasn't cleaning, he was just standing there, staring out the window. His reflection in the glass looked wrong, distorted somehow. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to say something. It felt like I was intruding, even though I was technically the one supposed to be there. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Everything okay, Martin?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't turn around, completely ignoring me. He just kept staring out the window. I waited a few more seconds before walking away, the unease settling deep in my gut. That was the first time I felt something was seriously off with him, but it was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other things, small things at first, but enough to raise alarm bells. Martin would always be in places where he had no reason to be. The janitorial staff had their designated areas, but I'd find him wandering the upper floors at odd hours, sometimes just standing in the middle of a hallway, as if waiting for something. The worst part? He would always seem to vanish the moment I turned the corner. I'd see him in the reflection of the glass doors, but by the time I reached that spot, he'd be gone. Then things started happening that I couldn't explain. It began with the cameras. One night I was watching the security monitors when I noticed static on one of the feeds. That's not unusual, the cameras glitch from time to time, but this was different. The static would flicker for a second, and then Martin would appear on the screen, standing perfectly still in a hallway I knew I had just checked. He wouldn't move, wouldn't clean, just stand there staring at something off camera. Then, just as suddenly, the feed would cut out, and when it came back, he'd be gone. Items started going missing from my desk, a pen here, a key card there. I thought maybe I was just being careless until I found them in strange places, an office supply closet that hadn't been used in months, or a stairwell nobody ever used. The night everything changed, I had decided to confront Martin. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow involved in the strange happenings around the building. I didn't know if he was messing with me, trying to scare me, or if something darker was going on, but I needed answers. It was a little past 2 a.m. when I saw him again on the cameras. He was on the lower level near the basement, a place he never had any reason to go. I watched as he stood outside one of the maintenance rooms, his hand resting on the door. This time I wasn't going to just watch. I grabbed my flashlight and headed downstairs, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The lower level was colder than the rest of the building, the air thick, with the hum of the HVAC system. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, amplifying the growing sense of dread in my chest. When I reached the maintenance room, the door was slightly ajar, and Martin was nowhere to be seen. Inside, the room was filled with cleaning supplies, tools, and spare parts for the building systems, but something felt wrong. I shined my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the dimly lit space, and that's when I saw a door. Not a regular door, this one was hidden behind a large metal shelving unit, almost as if someone had intentionally tried to conceal it. My heart raced as I moved the shelf aside, revealing the door fully. There was no handle, just a small keyhole and a rusted plaque that read "Authorized Personnel." Only I found a key on one of the shelves that fit the lock, and with a deep breath, I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell that led down into darkness. The stairs seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The smell hit me first, musty, damp, and something else, something metallic. My flashlight flickered as I reached the bottom, casting long, distorted shadows against the cracked cement walls. At the end of the hallway was another door, this one even older, its wood warped and splintering with age. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. The cold metal sent a shiver up my arm, and with a sense of impending dread, I pushed it open. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. The room was small, no bigger than a storage closet, but it was filled with items, boxes, and shelves overflowing with photographs, clothing, personal effects. And then there were the more disturbing things: tufts of hair, blood-stained rags, and bones. In the center of the room was a small, rusted cot, and on it lay a faded photograph of a family, Martin's family. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my flashlight beam shaking as I frantically searched for a way out. That's when I saw him. Martin was standing in the doorway, his expression calm, his eyes glinting in the dim light. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice shaking. Martin smiled, a slow, sinister smile that sent chills down my spine. "This," he said, gesturing to the room around him, "is where I keep the things I care about." I didn't wait for him to make a move. I bolted toward the door, pushing past him with all the strength I could muster. He reached out, trying to grab me, but I managed to break free, running up the stairs 2 at a time. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, but I didn't look back. I burst through the door at the top of the stairs, slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock. I didn't stop running until I was back in the security office, slamming the door and locking it behind me. I called the police, my fingers trembling as I dialed, barely able to explain what had happened. They arrived within minutes, but when they searched the building, Martin was gone. The room in the basement was exactly as I had left it, but there was no sign of him. They found evidence enough to launch a full investigation, but to this day, they've never found him. I quit the job the next morning. It's been months since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there watching, waiting. And sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear the sound of his footsteps echoing down empty hallways. Just like before, only now, I'm not there to stop him. When I first took the night shift at the office, I wasn't thrilled, but the extra pay was too good to pass up. My department was on a deadline for a huge project, and someone needed to stay late to monitor progress and make sure everything was on track. I volunteered, figuring it would be just a few quiet hours of catching up on work without distractions. The office building itself was your typical corporate setup: rows of cubicles, a break room with a coffee machine that never worked right, and fluorescent lights that buzzed just enough to drive you crazy. During the day, the place was bustling with people, the hum of phones ringing and keyboards clacking filling the air. But at night, when everyone else had gone home, it felt different. There's something unsettling about an empty office at night. The rows of cubicles stretch out like a maze, the dim emergency lighting casting strange shadows. I could hear every little sound: the creak of the building settling, the faint hum of the air conditioning. Even my own breathing seemed too loud. At first, the quiet was a relief. I liked the solitude, the peace of it all, but after a few nights, the peace started to feel more like isolation. Then strange things began to happen. One night I was working on a report when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from across the room. I looked up, expecting to see one of the cleaning crew, but the office was empty. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just some building system kicking in, but the sound kept coming: papers shuffling, chairs creaking as if someone was moving around just out of sight. It was subtle, almost too subtle to notice at first, but once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. I stood up and walked around the office, checking the cubicles, but there was no one there. The building was old, I reminded myself. Buildings make noises, that's all it was. But then things started to get weirder. The next night I came back from a break to find the papers on my desk scattered across the floor. At first I thought maybe I had knocked them off without realizing it, but as I bent down to pick them up, I noticed something strange. The papers weren't just scattered, they were arranged, spread out in a way that seemed deliberate. I felt a chill creep down my spine. I was the only one in the office, wasn't I? I checked the security system, all the doors were locked, and no one had come in or out since I arrived. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when the footsteps started. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was working on some spreadsheets, the glow of my monitor, the only light in the office. I was deep into my work when I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway, just outside the cubicles. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking down the hallway toward me. I strained to listen, trying to figure out who it could be. Maybe someone from the cleaning crew had arrived late, or maybe another employee had decided to pull an all-nighter. But no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't hear any doors opening or closing, no rustling of cleaning supplies, just those footsteps. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty office. No response. I stepped out of my cubicle, peeking around the corner into the hallway. It was empty. The footsteps had stopped. My heart was racing now, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was hearing things because I was tired, but deep down I knew something was wrong. A few nights later, the situation reached a new level. I was sitting at my desk, finishing up a report, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the wall behind me. It was quick, just a flicker, but it was enough to make me turn around. There was nothing there. I tried to focus on my work, but the shadow kept appearing just at the edge of my vision. It was like someone was standing behind me. You know, that indistinguishable feeling that there's a presence behind you, but every time I turned to look, the room was empty. The breaking point was when I caught a glimpse of something in my monitor, a reflection just behind me. In the dim light of the office, I saw the outline of a figure. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The office was empty, as it always was, but the reflection had been real. I knew it. That's when I started to panic. I called security, asking them to check the cameras, but they found nothing. No one had entered or left the building all night. I was alone, at least I was supposed to be. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I came in for my shift, I felt eyes on me, even though I was the only one there. I started hearing voices, faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I'd be sitting at my desk and I'd hear my name, like someone was calling me from down the hall. But when I went to check, there was never anyone there. The footsteps became more frequent too. I'd hear them almost every night, walking up and down the hallways, sometimes stopping just outside my cubicle. I'd sit there frozen, waiting for them to move on, but they wouldn't. They'd just stop, and I'd feel the overwhelming sense that someone was standing there, just on the other side of the wall, waiting for me to move. One night, after a particularly unsettling encounter where I'd seen a shadow pass by the window, even though I was on the 12th floor, I decided I needed to get to the bottom of this. I started asking around, trying to find out if anyone else had experienced anything strange in the building. That's when I learned about the accident. Years ago, before I started working there, an employee had died in the building. She had been working late one night, just like me, when she had a heart attack. No one found her until the next morning when the cleaning crew came in. She had been lying in her cubicle, her face pale and her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The story sent chills down my spine. Could it be her? Was she the one haunting the office, unable to move on? I tried to brush it off as an old office legend, just as a story meant to spook the night shift workers, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. One night I was finishing up my work when I felt it again, that cold presence, that feeling of being watched. I stood up and looked around the empty office. It was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft voice whispering my name. I turned toward the sound. The lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw her, a figure standing at the far end of the office, just beyond the glow of my desk lamp. She was pale, her eyes wide and vacant, her hair hanging limp around her face. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. She took a step forward, her feet making no sound on the carpeted floor. The lights flickered again, and she was gone. I grabbed my things and ran out of the office, not bothering to turn off my computer or lock up. I didn't care, I just needed to get out. I never went back to the night shift after that. I told my boss I couldn't do it anymore, and I didn't give him a reason. I didn't need to. The office is still there, of course. People still work late shifts, but no one ever talks about the strange things that happen after dark. The cleaning crew has their own stories, whispers of shadows moving in the hallways, of footsteps that shouldn't be there, but no one ever stays late alone anymore. As for me, I've moved on. I got a new job in a new building and I don't work nights anymore. But I'll never forget that face, those empty, staring eyes. And I know that she's still there, waiting in the darkness of that office, perhaps searching for someone to keep her company in her eternal night shift. I've been working the night shift at this warehouse for about 6 months. Honestly, it's not a bad job. Boring, yes, but not bad. I come in around 10 p.m., clock in, and spend the next 8 hours restocking shelves, organizing inventory, and preparing shipments. The warehouse is massive, filled with rows upon rows of powering shelves that stretch far into the distance. At night, it's just me and the quiet. I'm not sure when it started. At first, I figured I was just tired. Working night shifts does that to you. Your mind plays tricks on you in the dark, especially in a place as big and empty as this. But lately I've been hearing things, little noises, footsteps, the soft creak of metal, and a faint scratching sound like something being dragged across the floor. I tried to brush it off, thinking it must be rats or pigeons, but something about the way those sounds echoed through the warehouse, bouncing off the concrete floors and the towering shelves, felt wrong, like someone was in here with me. But that's impossible. I'm the only one working the night shift. At least that's what I thought. The first time I really noticed something strange was on a Thursday night a few weeks ago. I was restocking one of the back aisles, the kind that doesn't get much foot traffic even during the day. I had a pallet of boxes to unload and was deep into the task when I heard a faint clatter, like something had fallen over. I paused, the sound echoing through the space. For a moment I stood there listening. Nothing. I shook my head, figuring it was just something that had shifted on the shelves, but then I heard it again, this time closer. I grabbed my flashlight and peered down the aisle. Everything seemed normal. The shelves were in place, the boxes stacked where I'd left them. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything else, but there was only silence. The following night, I was organizing inventory near the back of the warehouse, the farthest point from the loading dock. The lights were always dimmer back there, and the air felt cooler, almost like the temperature dropped a few degrees the further back you went. It was probably just a quirk of the building, but it always made me feel uneasy. I was about halfway through my shift when I saw a shadow. It darted between the rows of shelves. My hand gripped the box cutter a little tighter as my eyes scanned the aisles. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No response. I stood there, waiting for the shadow to reappear, but nothing happened. I took a deep breath and moved closer to where I'd seen it, shining my flashlight down the aisle, but there was nothing, just row after row of boxes and shelves, all neatly organized. The following week, the noises grew worse. It wasn't just random clattering or the hum of the building anymore. I started hearing footsteps, clear, unmistakable footsteps. It always happened around the same time, sometime after midnight. I'd be working, minding my own business, when I'd hear them echoing through the warehouse. Sometimes they seemed far away, but other times they sounded like they were coming from the next aisle over. I'd drop whatever I was doing and rush over, but no one was ever there. One night, after hearing the footsteps yet again, I decided to check the security footage more carefully. I went to the management office and started scrolling through the feed. Everything seemed normal until I got to the footage from the back of the warehouse. There, on the screen, I saw a figure. It was faint, almost like a blur, but it was there, moving between the rows of shelves just like I'd seen in the corner of my eye. I paused the footage and stared at the screen, my heart racing. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person moving too quickly for the camera to focus. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining things. Something or someone was in the warehouse with me. The next night, I almost didn't come to work. I'd been feeling on edge for weeks, but I couldn't afford to miss a shift. Rent was due, and I needed the paycheck. So I clocked in, grabbed my clipboard, and got to work, trying to ignore the pit of dread in my stomach. Everything was fine for the first couple of hours, quiet, just like always. But around midnight, things started to go wrong. I was stacking boxes in one of the far aisles when I heard a crash from the front of the warehouse. My heart jumped into my throat as I grabbed my flashlight and hurried toward the sound. When I got there, I found a pallet of boxes scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had shoved them over. I checked the security feed again, but the footage was useless, just static. That had never happened before. Before I could make a decision about what to do, the lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint beam of my flashlight. That's when I heard the footsteps. But this time they weren't far away, they were close. too close. I stood there frozen, listening as the footsteps grew louder, closer. My flashlight shook in my hand as I slowly turned around, shining the beam down the aisle. And that's when I saw a figure standing at the far end of the aisle. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, but I could see the faint outline of a person. They were just standing there, staring at me. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. I took a step back, my hands shaking as I tried to keep the flashlight steady. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. And then, without warning, it started moving toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, sprinting down the aisle as fast as I could. I could hear the footsteps behind me echoing off the walls. I darted through the maze of shelves, trying to find a way out. The warehouse felt like a labyrinth, the rows of boxes stretching out endlessly in every direction. Finally, I reached the loading dock. I slammed my hand against the emergency door release, and with a loud beep, the door swung open. I stumbled outside, gasping for breath, and turned to look behind me. The figure was gone. The warehouse was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. I quit the next day. The warehouse was haunted or cursed or something. I didn't care. All I knew was that whatever had been in there with me that night wasn't human. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. Driving deliveries for a small courier firm isn't my dream job, but it gets the bills covered. Most of the time, the work is straightforward: pick up the package, drop it off, repeat. I usually do day shifts, but with the holiday rush, I was asked to cover some night deliveries. At first, I was fine with it, driving through quiet streets with no traffic, listening to my favorite podcasts. On my first night, I was scheduled to deliver a few packages to a business district about an hour outside of town. It was already dark by the time I left the warehouse, the kind of cold, moonless night that made everything seem a little more sinister. Still, I wasn't too worried. I'd done late-night runs before and never had any issues. The business district I was heading to was a weird spot. It was part of an industrial park with rows of warehouses and offices tucked away in a remote area just off the main highway. The place was pretty much deserted after dark. No one worked there at night, which meant it was usually quiet. Almost too quiet. As I drove down the long stretch of road leading to the industrial park, I kept telling myself it was just another delivery in and out. But something felt different that night. The air felt heavier, and there was a sense of unease I couldn't shake. I arrived at the industrial park just before midnight. The whole area was eerily silent, with only a few dim streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The warehouses and office buildings loomed like silent giants, their windows dark and uninviting. I parked my van in front of the first building on my route, a large nondescript office with a plain concrete exterior. I grabbed the package from the back of the van and walked toward the entrance. It was supposed to be a simple drop-off: scan the package, leave it in the designated drop box, and go. But as I approached the door, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the dim glow of a flickering light inside. That wasn't normal. The place should have been locked up for the night with no one around. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should go inside and see if anyone was there, but my instincts told me to just drop the package and leave. I decided to leave it in the drop box and get out of there. As I scanned the package, I felt like someone was watching me. I couldn't explain it. It was just this creeping sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I finished the delivery and quickly walked back to my van, trying to shake off the feeling. But as I climbed into the driver's seat and glanced back at the building, the door was now closed. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had blown the door shut, even though I hadn't heard any noise. My next delivery was at a warehouse on the far edge of the industrial park, even more isolated than the first location. I followed the narrow, winding road that led to the building, my headlights the only light. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal siding glinting faintly in the dim light. I parked the van near the entrance and grabbed the package. As I approached the door, I saw something, or rather, someone standing near the back of the building. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could make out the figure of a man standing perfectly still near the loading dock. He wasn't moving, just standing there facing away from me, his posture unnaturally stiff, like he was waiting for something. "Hey," I called out, my voice echoing through the quiet night. "You work here." The figure didn't respond. He didn't move at all. I felt my heart rate quicken as I took a step closer, my hand tightening around the package. Something about the way he was standing, the stillness of it, sent a chill down my spine. I took another step forward, but just as I did, the figure vanished. I blinked, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone, like he just disappeared into thin air. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I quickly dropped the package off and rushed back to my van. I started the engine, my hands shaking, and sped out of there without looking back. My final delivery of the night was at a small office building at the very edge of the industrial park. The place looked abandoned, no lights, no cars in the lot, and the windows were covered in grime like no one had been there for years. But the address matched the one on the package, so I figured it was just an old building that hadn't been updated in the system. I parked the van and got out, the cold air biting at my skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked toward the building. As I approached the front door, I noticed something strange, a piece of paper taped to the glass. It looked like some kind of note hastily written in red marker. I squinted in the dim light, trying to make out the words "Leave now. You being watched." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? A joke left by a bored employee? But then I remembered the figure I'd seen earlier, and my stomach churned with dread. Suddenly the air felt heavier, suffocating. I glanced around, but the lot was empty. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I dropped the package at the door, my hands trembling, and turned to head back to the van. But as I started walking, I heard a soft rustling sound coming from behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I turned around. The figure was back. He was standing in the shadows near the corner of the building, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his features, but I knew it was him, the same figure I'd seen at the warehouse, the same unnerving stillness, the same eerie presence. Panic surged through me as I turned and ran to the van, my heart pounding in my ears. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. But as I started the engine, I saw him again. He was standing in the middle of the road directly in front of the van, his face still obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning through the darkness. I didn't wait. I floored the gas pedal, swerving around him. My headlights caught a brief glimpse of his figure as I sped past, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I drove out of that industrial park as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I kept looking in the mirrors, but the road behind me was empty. When I finally returned to the warehouse to drop off the van, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. As I handed in my keys and clocked out, I saw the dispatcher looking at me with a strange expression. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then he shook his head and handed me my receipt. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice sounding more casual than I felt. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's just strange." Another driver reported seeing someone hanging around the industrial park last week, said it creeped him out. My stomach dropped. "Did they say what he looked like?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, just said he felt like he was being followed." "It's been a few days since that night, and I haven't gone back to work." I told them I was sick, but the truth is, I'm scared that if I go back, I'll see him again. Working the night shift at Waldbaum's supermarket was usually uneventful. I liked the quiet, the solitude, and the chance to get work done without the usual hustle and bustle of the daytime crowd. The store was closed to customers, and my main tasks involved stocking shelves, cleaning up, and preparing for the next day. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the empty aisles. It was around midnight when the incident began, an experience that still sends chills down my spine. I was in aisle 6, stocking cereal boxes on the top shelf. The silence was comforting, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigeration units. As I worked, I heard a faint sound like the rustling of paper. I paused, listening intently. The sound stopped, and I shrugged it off as the building settling or perhaps a mouse. A few minutes later, the sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the next aisle over. I grabbed my flashlight and walked around the corner, shining the beam down the long empty aisle. There was nothing there. I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me and went back to my task. The uneasy feeling lingered as I continued my work. Every so often I heard faint footsteps echoing through the store. I told myself it was probably just the sound of my own movements reverberating off the walls, but then I saw a shadowy figure at the end of the aisle, just for a split second before it disappeared around the corner. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly walked to the end of the aisle and peered around the corner, but there was no one there. I felt a growing sense of dread. The supermarket was supposed to be empty, the doors were locked, and I was the only one with a key. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved to the back of the store where the storage room was located. The large metal shelves were lined with boxes and supplies. The room was cold, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. As I was sorting through a stack of boxes, I heard the sound again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the front of the store. I grabbed my flashlight and box cutter and cautiously made my way back to the main area. When I reached the front of the store, I saw the shadowy figure again, standing by the entrance. It was a man, tall and dressed in dark clothing. His face was obscured by the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I called out, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. I felt a surge of fear and anger. "The store is closed. You need to leave," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. The man slowly turned and walked down an aisle, disappearing from sight. I followed him cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the end of the aisle, he was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank, someone trying to scare me. I decided to check the security cameras in the manager's office. The small room was cluttered with paperwork and old files. I sat down at the desk and pulled up the live feed from the cameras. As I scanned the various angles of the store, my eyes were drawn to a movement on one of the screens. The man was back, standing in the middle of aisle 6, the same aisle where I had first seen the shadow. He stood perfectly still, staring directly at the camera as if he knew I was watching. A chill ran down my spine as I watched the screen. The man began to move slowly, walking down the aisle toward the camera. His face was still hidden in shadows, but I could see his eyes cold and menacing. He reached the end of the aisle and disappeared from view again. I felt a wave of panic. I had to do something. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking. Wallbaum Supermarket, night shift, I stammered. There's someone in the store. I think they're trying to scare me. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but the wait felt like an eternity. I locked myself in the manager's office, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept my eyes glued to the security monitors, watching for any sign of the intruder. Minutes passed, and the man reappeared on the screen, standing in the middle of the store. This time he was closer to the office. I could hear the faint sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. The door handle to the office rattled, and I felt my blood run cold. I braced myself, clutching the box cutter tightly. The door swung open, and the man stood there, his face still obscured. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He took a step forward, and I swung the box cutter, the blade slicing through the air. The man stopped, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the store. I heard the distant wail of sirens approaching, and I felt a surge of relief. The police arrived within minutes, their flashlights cutting through the gloom as they searched the store. They found no sign of the intruder. The doors were still locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. It was as if the man had never been there. The officers took my statement, but without any evidence, there was little they could do. They advised me to take the rest of the night off and suggested that the store install better security measures. I left the store, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Who was the man? How did he get in? And why was he there? The experience left me shaking, and I couldn't bring myself to work the night shift again. To this day, the memory of that night haunts me. Every time I pass by Wallbaum's, I feel a chill run down my spine. The night shift at a gas station on a lonely stretch of country highway had its perks. It was usually quiet, giving me time to catch up on reading or listen to music. The occasional trucker would stop by to fuel up, but otherwise it was just me in the endless expanse of darkness. I never minded the solitude until one night when that solitude turned into something terrifying. It was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting behind the counter flipping through a magazine. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating an eerie atmosphere in the small convenience store. The only sounds were the distant croak of frogs from the nearby fields. As I was engrossed in an article, I heard the bell above the door chime, signaling that someone had pulled up to the pumps. I glanced up at the security monitor and saw an old beat-up car idling by pump number 3. The driver hadn't gotten out yet, and the engine continued to run. A few minutes passed, and the driver still hadn't moved. I felt a twinge of unease but brushed it off, telling myself that maybe they were just taking a moment to gather themselves. I returned to my magazine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to step outside and see if the driver needed help. As I opened the door, the cool night air hit me, and I could hear the low rumble of the car's engine. I approached the vehicle, waving my flashlight to get the driver's attention. "Hey there, need any help?" I called out, but there was no response. I shone the flashlight into the car, and that's when I saw a man sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. His face was obscured by shadows, and he didn't even glance in my direction. A shiver ran down my spine as I called out again, louder this time. "Sir, do you need any help?" Still no response. He just sat there, staring blankly into the distance. My heart began to race, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the car. I returned to the store and locked the door behind me, my hands trembling. I kept an eye on the security monitor, watching as the man continued to sit in his car, motionless. The unease in my stomach grew stronger, and I decided to call the police. "There's a man sitting in his car at pump 3, I told the dispatcher. "He's been there for a while and isn't responding to me. It's really freaking me out." The dispatcher assured me that an officer was on the way, but said it would take some time given the remote location. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a little more reassured but still on edge. A few minutes later, the man finally moved. He opened the car door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. I watched on the monitor as he walked around the car. His face was still difficult to see. He seemed to be looking for something, but I couldn't tell what. Suddenly he turned and started walking toward the store. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him approach. His gait was strange, almost robotic, and there was something unnerving about the way he moved. I quickly locked the inner door to the counter area and grabbed the phone, ready to call the police again. The man reached the door and tried the handle. Finding it locked, he stood there for a moment, then began to pound on the glass, his face pressed against it. Fear surged through me as I backed away from the counter. The man continued to pound on the door, his expression wild and angry. I could hear his muffled voice, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. "Go away," I shouted, my voice trembling. "The police are on their way." The man paused, his head tilting to one side as if he were considering my words. Then he stepped back and disappeared from view. I rushed to the security monitor and saw him walking back to his car. He got in and drove away, his headlights disappearing into the night. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A few minutes later, the police arrived, and I told them what had happened. They took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area, but there wasn't much else they could do. I stayed inside the locked store, my nerves on edge. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I kept the lights on and waited for my shift to end, counting down the minutes until I could go home. When morning finally came, I left the store and drove home, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the image of the man's shadowed face pressing against the glass. I returned to work the next night, but the fear lingered. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking the security monitors more frequently. The quiet of the night, once comforting, now felt oppressive and filled with unseen threats. The police never found the man or his car. The experience changed me, making me more cautious and aware of my surroundings. I still work the night shift, but I'm always on guard, always watching for any sign of danger. A shiver still runs down my spine whenever I think about that night.